That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. What started as another day on the road became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, we show that behind the engines and the leather, there are still human hearts. The snow fell in heavy, reluctant flakes outside the community centre in Eldridge, a forgotten speck on the map along Route 66, where the desert met the edge of winter's bite. It was the night of the annual Christmas party, the kind thrown by the local mill to keep spirits from crumbling under the weight of layoffs and empty promises. Strings of lights flickered against the frost-laced windows, casting a pale glow on the parking lot where pickup trucks and a few weathered sedans huddled like survivors. Inside, the air smelled of pine needles from the donated tree and the faint, acrid tang of cheap coffee brewing in the corner. Laughter echoed unevenly, forced through gritted teeth by folks who knew the mill's doors might not open come January. Jack Harlan stood at the edge of the room, his broad shoulders hunched under a faded leather jacket patched with the emblem of the Iron Hawks, a simple hawk's wing etched in silver thread. He wasn't one for these gatherings, but his daughter, Ellie, had tugged at his sleeve that afternoon, her eyes wide with the fragile hope of a 7-year-old. "Please, Dad, just this once." She'd baked cookies at school, lopsided stars dusted with too much sugar, and he couldn't say no, not after the year they'd had. Jack sipped from a paper cup of punch that tasted like watered-down regret, his calloused fingers leaving prints on the rim. His boots, scuffed from miles of highway, left faint mud tracks on the linoleum floor. Across the room, the CEO of the mill, Richard Voss, held court near the punch bowl. Voss was a man built like a ledger. Tall, angular, with a suit that screamed boardrooms, far from this dust-choked town. He smiled for the cameras from the local paper, his voice booming about community spirit and holiday cheer. But his eyes scanned the crowd like he was tallying inventory. Jack had crossed paths with him once, months back, when the Iron Hawks had rolled into town for a repair job at the garage. Voss had nodded curtly, mistaking Jack for just another drifter, another shadow on the margins. Jack hadn't corrected him. Words were cheap. The road taught you that. Ellie darted through the legs of mill workers, her red ribbon unraveling from her ponytail, clutching a paper plate with her cookies. She offered one to a cluster of kids near the tree, her small voice piping up over the hum of conversation. "Want one? I made 'em myself." The children took them politely, but one boy, the son of a foreman, wrinkled his nose. "They look funny. Did your dad make you eat the burnt ones?" Laughter rippled, light but cutting, and Ellie's face crumpled like tissue paper in the rain. Jack watched from afar, his chest tightening, the familiar ache of helplessness rising like exhaust in his throat. He set down his cup, the liquid sloshing softly, and crossed the room in 3 long strides. "Ellie," he said, kneeling to her level, his voice low and steady, like the rumble of his Harley idling at dawn. He brushed a flake of sugar from her cheek, his thumb lingering a second too long. "You did good, kiddo. Real good." She nodded, but her lower lip trembled, and she buried her face in his jacket, the leather cool against her warmth. The room seemed to pause, breaths held in the spaces between carols playing from a tinny speaker. Voss glanced over, his brow furrowing slightly, as if this interruption was an inefficiency to note. Jack stood, lifting Ellie into his arms with effortless strength, born of years carrying more than his share. Her weight was an anchor, grounding him against the pull of old ghosts, the wife who'd left when the cancer came, the brothers in the Hawks who'd pulled him from the abyss after. He carried her toward the coat rack, the party's chatter fading behind them like distant thunder. Outside, the wind whipped through the lot, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. Snow crunched under his boots as he settled Ellie in the truck, buckling her in with hands that shook just enough to betray him. "It's okay, Dad," she whispered, but her eyes were shiny, reflecting the neon glow from the center's sign. He lingered by the door, staring at the dashboard where a small plastic Santa dangled from the rear view, a gift from Ellie last year. The party lights blurred in the falling snow, and something in Jack cracked, a quiet fracture, like ice on a frozen river. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, the salt sting sharp against the winter air. Tears weren't his style, the road didn't allow for them. But tonight, with Ellie sniffling softly beside him, the weight pressed down. He turned the key, the engine coughing to life with a low growl that echoed his own unspoken grief. Back inside, unnoticed in the shuffle, a figure in a rented Santa suit watched from the shadowed doorway. It was Tommy Reyes, one of the Ironhawks, who'd ridden in earlier that day on a tip about a parts run. Tommy adjusted the white beard, his eyes narrowing under the hood as he saw Jack's truck pull away, taillights fading into the storm. The Brotherhood had a code, etched deeper than ink. You don't leave a brother to the wolves. Tommy glanced back at the party, where Voss was shaking hands, oblivious. Then, with a nod to the night, Santa stepped out into the snow, his boots leaving deliberate prints toward the parking lot. Voss, pausing mid-conversation, caught the movement through the window. His glass halted halfway to his lips, shock etching lines across his polished face as the red-suited figure vanished into the whiteout. What kind of town was this, where holiday cheer hid such strangeness? The CEO set down his drink, the clink lost in the music, a flicker of unease stirring in the pit of his stomach. Outside, the desert wind howled, carrying whispers of roads untaken and loyalties unspoken. Jack drove on, unaware that the night was just beginning to unravel, pulling them all into its quiet storm. The truck's wipers slapped rhythmically against the windshield, smearing the snow into streaks that mirrored the blur in Jack's vision. Ellie hummed a carol under her breath, her small hand finding his on the gear shift. In that moment the world narrowed to the heat of her palm and the endless black ribbon of highway ahead, where mercy waited in the shadows, disguised as myth. The highway stretched out like a vein of black ice under the truck's headlights, the snowflakes swirling in frantic patterns against the glass. Jack's grip tightened on the wheel, the leather of his gloves creaking softly, as if the sound could hold back the ache building behind his eyes. Eldridge faded in the rear view, its light smudged into hazy orbs, leaving only the low hum of the heater and Ellie's quiet breathing to fill the cab. She shifted in her seat, pulling her coat tighter, the fabric whispering against the vinyl. "Dad, why'd we leave early? The cookies were okay, right?" Her voice was small, probing the edges of the silence like a finger testing a bruise. Jack glanced at her, the dashboard glow casting shadows across his stubbled jaw. "Yeah, kiddo, they were the best." He forced a half smile, but it felt like lifting weights, the effort pulling at something deep in his chest. The truth hung unspoken. The party was a reminder of all they'd lost. The way the Mills cheer masked the layoffs that had stripped families bare. His own job at the roadside garage hung by a thread, pieced together from oil changes and the occasional Harley tune-up for the Ironhawks when they passed through. Loyalty kept him afloat, the brothers who rode with him, who shared more than roots and repairs. But tonight, with Ellie's disappointment echoing his own, the road felt longer, heavier. Miles ticked by, the wiper's steady thump marking time like a heartbeat. The neon sign of the Desert Rose Diner flickered into view, a beacon on the outskirts where truckers and wanderers converged. Jack pulled into the lot, gravel crunching under the tires, the engine's rumble dying to a sigh. It was a habit. This stop, neutral ground between the isolation of home and the pull of the open road. The diner squatted low against the storm, its windows fogged with warmth, the scent of frying bacon and strong coffee seeping out as he opened the door for Ellie. She clutched his hand, her boots slipping slightly on the slick pavement, and he lifted her over a puddle, the cold water reflecting fractured stars. Inside, the air was thick with the murmur of late-night confessions and the sizzle from the grill. Formica tables gleamed under fluorescent lights that buzzed like distant insects. and a jukebox in the corner crooned a faded country tune about lost loves and dusty trails. Maria, the waitress who'd been pouring coffee here since Jack was a boy, spotted them from behind the counter. Her apron was stained with the day's battles, ketchup smears and coffee rings, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot, but her eyes held a quiet fire, the kind forged from raising 2 kids alone after her husband rode off into a bottle. "Jack Harlan, you look like the snow dragged you in. And little Ellie, come for pie?" She slid 2 mugs across the counter, steam curling up like ghosts without waiting for an answer. Ellie perked up, sliding onto a stool with a small grin. "Apple, please, with extra whipped cream." Maria nodded, her movements efficient yet gentle, like she understood the fragility of small joys. Jack watched as she served them, her hands steady despite the faint tremor from long shifts. She'd lost her sister to the cancer wards upstate last year, the same shadow that had taken his wife, and in the quiet hours they'd shared nods over coffee, unspoken bonds between survivors scraping by on tips and grit. "Rough night at the mill party?" Maria asked, low enough that only he could hear, her gaze flicking to Ellie's absorbed focus on the menu's faded drawings. Jack shrugged, the leather of his jacket shifting with a soft rasp. "Same as always, folks pretending the world's not closing in." He stirred sugar into his coffee, the spoon clinking against porcelain, watching the granules dissolve like fading hopes. Outside, headlights cut through the flurry, a lone bike pulling up, its engine a deep, throaty purr that cut through the wind. Tommy Reyes dismounted, shaking snow from his beard, but he wasn't in the Santa suit anymore. It lay bundled in his saddlebag, traded for the familiar cut of the Iron Hawk's vest. He stamped his boots on the mat, the bell above the door jingling like a warning, and scanned the room until his eyes landed on Jack. Tommy slid onto the stool beside Ellie, his presence filling the space without overwhelming it. A broad man with scars like road maps on his knuckles from fixing engines and fixing fights. He'd been the one to pull Jack into the Hawks years back after the funeral, when the grief had Jack riding blind into the night. "Heard you bailed early," Tommy said, his voice gravelly but warm, ordering black coffee from Maria with a nod. She poured it without a word, knowing the code. Riders didn't pry, but they showed up. Ellie looked up, her eyes widening at the Hawk emblem on his vest. "Are you a real biker, like Dad?" Tommy chuckled, a low rumble that eased the tension in Jack's shoulders. "Something like that, Squirt. Your dad's the real deal, keeps us all running smooth." He pulled a small wrapped candy from his pocket, the kind with a faded Christmas stripe, and slid it to her. "For the best cookie baker in Eldridge." Ellie's face lit up, unwrapping it with careful fingers, the crinkle of foil breaking the diner's hush. Jack met Tommy's gaze over her head, a silent question passing between them. "Why the follow?" Tommy just tapped his temple, the gesture meaning later. The Brotherhood's way of weaving protection without words. Across the lot, in the shadow of his sleek company SUV, Richard Voss idled with the engine running, the defroster humming against the frost. He'd left the party shortly after the Santa figure vanished, curiosity, or was it suspicion, driving him onto the road. The diner lights spilled out, illuminating the truck where Jack sat, and Voss's fingers drummed on the wheel, the polished ring glinting. He'd built the mill on efficiencies, cutting corners to keep the numbers green, but this town clung to its outcasts like burrs, the bikers who fixed what he broke, the single mothers who somehow endured. Watching Jack through the steamed window, Voss felt an unfamiliar twinge, like the first crack in a ledger's balance. Who was this man, leaving in tears, drawing a Santa-suited shadow? The CEO shifted into gear, but instead of driving on, he cut the lights, the snow muffling his unease. Back inside, Maria cleared their plates, her hand brushing Jack's arm in a fleeting gesture of solidarity. "You two hold on. Roads like this, they test you, but they lead somewhere." Jack nodded, the coffee's bitterness lingering on his tongue as Tommy stood, clapping his shoulder lightly. The bell jingled again as they stepped out, the cold wrapping around them like an old debt. Ellie's hand found Jack's once more, warm against the chill, and Tommy mounted his bike, the engine roaring to life, a promise in the dark. The highway waited, empty and unforgiving, but in that shared silence, the weight felt a fraction lighter, the first threads of something unspoken beginning to bind them against the storm. The snow had thickened into a relentless curtain by the time they stepped back into the night, the diner's neon sign humming faintly behind them like a fading heartbeat. Jack's breath clouded in the air, sharp and metallic, as he helped Ellie into the truck, her small frame shivering against the door. The cab's interior light spilled a warm amber glow, momentarily cutting through the white haze, but it couldn't touch the chill settling deeper in his bones. Tommy lingered by his bike, wiping frost from the handlebars with a gloved hand, the motion deliberate, unhurried. His eyes flicked toward the shadows across the lot, where Voss's SUV sat idling like a predator in wait. But he said nothing. The Hawks didn't spook easy, and neither did Jack. "Follow us home?" Jack asked, his voice low, carried away by the wind's low moan. It wasn't a question, really. The road had taught them to read the currents, the unspoken needs that bound them tighter than blood. Tommy nodded once, swinging a leg over the saddle, the leather seat creaking under his weight. The bike's engine caught with a throaty cough, exhaust mingling with the scent of wet pine drifting from the nearby scrub. Ellie waved from the window, her face pressed to the glass, leaving a foggy imprint that blurred her smile. Jack climbed in, the door thudding shut like a punctuation mark, and shifted into drive. Tires spinning briefly on the slick gravel before finding purchase. The highway unspooled ahead, flanked by skeletal cottonwoods bowed under the snow's burden, their branches whispering secrets to the storm. Jack's headlights carved twin tunnels through the flurry, illuminating patches of asphalt scarred by winter's grip, cracks like old wounds, filled with ice that gleamed treacherously. Ellie's head nodded against the seatbelt, her eyelids heavy from the late hour and the emotional ebb of the evening. He reached over, adjusting the blanket across her lap, the wool rough under his fingers, carrying the faint scent of home-baked bread from earlier that day. These small acts anchored him, reminders that life persisted in the margins. Beyond the roar of engines and the grind of daily survival, miles slipped by in contemplative silence, broken only by the rhythmic slap of wipers and the distant growl of Tommy's bike trailing a respectful distance behind. Jack's mind wandered to the garage back in Eldridge, where he'd spent the morning elbow-deep in a transmission, grease blackening his nails like ink from an unwritten letter. The place was a sanctuary of sorts, cluttered with rusted tools and half-rebuilt Harleys, run by old Pete, a veteran with a limp from Nam and a heart that remembered every brother lost. Pete had taken Jack on after the funeral, no questions asked, just a nod and a toolbox shoved his way. "Roads full of strays," he'd said, his voice gravel from years of chain-smoking. "Fix what's broke, son. Starts with you." The thought pulled Jack's gaze to the rear view, where Tommy's single headlight bobbed like a faithful lantern. The Iron Hawks weren't outlaws in the stories the town spun, no raids or vendettas, but a loose kin of wanderers who mended what society overlooked. They'd pooled cash last spring to cover Maria's niece's medical bills after a car wreck on the interstate. No fanfare, just an envelope slid under her door. Or the time they'd ridden out to pull a stranded family from a ditch during a flash flood, engines thundering through the downpour while sirens wailed too far off. It was loyalty woven into the leather, compassion disguised as grit. Jack had found his place there after Sarah's death, the cancer eating her from the inside while he rode endless loops to outrun the helplessness. The Hawks had pulled him back, one shared mile at a time. Ahead, The turnoff to their trailer park emerged from the gloom, a cluster of weathered homes hunkered against the desert's edge, lit by sporadic porch lights that fought the snow like defiant embers. Jack slowed, the truck's brakes hissing softly, and guided them down the rutted lane where sodium lamps cast long orange shadows. Their trailer sat at the end, a modest single wide with a sagging awning and Ellie's drawings taped to the frost-rimed windows. Stick-figure families under crayon suns. He parked, the engine ticking as it cooled, and carried Ellie inside, her weight limp and trusting against his chest. The door creaked open to the smell of lingering cocoa from breakfast, the space cramped but warm, heated by a space heater's faint buzz. Tommy pulled up outside, killing his bike with a final sputter, and followed at a distance, boots crunching on the thin layer of snow that dusted the steps. Inside, Jack laid Ellie in her bed, tucking the covers around her with hands that still trembled faintly from the night's undercurrents. She murmured something about cookies and Santa, her breath evening out into sleep's gentle rhythm. He stood there a moment, the room's dim lamp painting soft edges on her face, the weight of fatherhood pressing like an invisible vest, protect her always, no matter the cost. In the kitchenette, Tommy shrugged off his vest, hanging it on a chair with a quiet rustle, revealing a faded tattoo of a hawk in flight across his forearm. He poured 2 mugs of reheated coffee from a pot left on the counter, the steam rising in lazy spirals. "Party got to you," he said, not accusing, just stating, handing Jack the mug. The ceramic warmed his palms, grounding the swirl of emotions. Jack leaned against the counter, the formica cooled through his shirt, and nodded. Ellie. She tries so hard. Reminds me of Sarah, holding it together. His voice cracked on the name, a rare slip, the grief surfacing like oil from cracked earth. Tommy sipped his coffee, black and bitter, his eyes steady. "We all carry ghosts, brother, but you ain't riding alone." Outside, the wind rattled the trailer's thin walls, and through the window, the faint outline of Voss's SUV lingered at the park's entrance, headlights off, but engine's low hum betraying his vigil. What drove a man like that to shadow them? Curiosity, or something sharper? Tommy noticed it too, his jaw tightening imperceptibly, but he let the silence stretch, the Brotherhood's way. Watch, wait, protect without fanfare. Jack set down his mug, the clink echoing softly, and glanced at Ellie's door. The night had peeled back layers, exposing the raw edges of their lives on the fringes. But in Tommy's quiet presence, there was a thread of solace, a reminder that strength wasn't in solitude. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in hushed white, as if the desert itself held its breath, waiting for the kindness buried in the storm to surface. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and loyalty can travel. The first light of dawn crept through the trailer's thin curtains like a hesitant intruder, painting the kitchenette in muted greys and golds. Jack hadn't slept much, his body heavy from the night's vigil, the coffee from hours ago turning bitter in his stomach. He stood by the sink, rinsing mugs with water that ran too cold, the splash echoing in the quiet space. Ellie's soft snores filtered from her room, a fragile rhythm that kept him anchored, while Tommy had crashed on the worn couch, his boots left by the door in a neat row, laces untied like an afterthought. The air inside carried the faint, comforting scent of yesterday's pine from the party decorations Ellie had smuggled home, now wilting on the fridge. Outside, the snow had eased to a lazy drift, blanketing the park in a deceptive hush that muffled the world's rough edges. Jack peered through the frost-etched window, his breath fogging the glass, and spotted the SUV still parked at the entrance, a dark silhouette against the paling sky. Voss hadn't moved through the night, or if he had, he'd returned, his presence a silent question mark. Jack's jaw tightened, the stubble rasping under his fingers as he rubbed his chin. Why follow? The CEO's world was suits and spreadsheets, miles from the grease and gravel of Jack's life. But curiosity had a way of bridging divides, especially in a town where secrets fermented like old wine. Tommy stirred on the couch, the springs creaking under his shift, and sat up with a low groan, rubbing the back of his neck. His eyes, sharp despite the fatigue, met Jack's across the room. No words needed, just the shared understanding of men who'd stared down worse than a corporate shadow. "I'll handle the watch," Tommy murmured, his voice rough from sleep, pulling on his vest with a soft zip of leather. He stepped to the door, pausing to glance at Ellie's room, a flicker of something paternal softening his features. The Hawks weren't fathers by blood to her, but they'd become uncles in the quiet ways, fixing her bike's chain last summer, leaving tools small enough for her hands at the garage. Jack nodded, grateful for the reprieve, and slipped into Ellie's room. She was curled under the quilt, her red ribbon tangled in her hair like a forgotten flag. He sat on the bed's edge, the mattress dipping under his weight, and smoothed the covers with a gentleness that belied his calloused hands. The room was a child's sanctuary amid the trailer's austerity, posters of wild horses taped crookedly to the walls, a stuffed bear propped against the headboard, its fur worn from years of secrets whispered in the dark. Ellie stirred, her eyes fluttering open, blue and clear, like the desert sky after rain. "Dad? Is it morning already?" Her voice was thick with sleep, but she reached for him, her small hand finding his. "Yeah, kiddo. Time for breakfast." He lifted her into a hug, her warmth seeping through his shirt, chasing away the night's chill. In her embrace, the party's sting faded, replaced by the simple truth of their bond, two against the world's indifferent grind. But as he carried her to the kitchen, the weight of unspoken worries pressed in. The garage's uncertain future, the mill's looming closures that rippled through Eldridge like aftershocks. Single dads like him, on the edges with a daughter to raise, were easy marks for judgment. Drifters, unreliable, hearts too scarred to hold steady. The percolator bubbled on the stove, filling the air with the rich, grounding aroma of fresh brew. Tommy had already stepped out, his bike's engine idling low in the lot, a subtle barrier between them and whatever Voss intended. Jack set Ellie at the table, pouring cereal into a bowl with mechanical care, the milk carton sweating beads of condensation. She ate quietly at first, spoon clinking against porcelain, but her gaze drifted to the window. "Who's that man in the big car? He was there last night, too." Her words hung, innocent yet piercing, forcing Jack to confront the intrusion. "Just someone from the party, probably lost his way in the snow." He kept his tone even, but his eyes flicked outside, where Tommy circled slowly on his bike, the tires carving dark paths in the fresh powder. Voss's SUV remained, its driver visible now in the growing light, a figure hunched over the wheel, phone in hand, perhaps calling in favors or piecing together Jack's life like a puzzle. The CEO's world viewed the Iron Hawks through a lens of suspicion, rough men on roaring machines, threats to order rather than its quiet guardians. Whispers in town painted them as relics of a wilder era, heartless wanderers who preyed on the vulnerable. But Jack knew the truth. Their code was forged in compassion, mending what the law overlooked, like the time they'd ridden through a blizzard to deliver medicine to old Pete's sick wife, engines cutting the night while ambulances stalled on icy roads. Ellie's spoon paused midway to her mouth, milk dripping back into the bowl with a soft plop. "He looks sad, like when you miss Mom." Her observation cut deeper than intended, her child's intuition stripping away the facades adults clung to. Jack knelt beside her, his knee cracking faintly on the linoleum, and cupped her face in his hands. "We all carry a little sad sometimes, Ellie, but we've got each other, and friends who watch out." He thought of Tommy outside, of Maria at the diner with her steady hands, of the Hawks scattered along the routes, bound by loyalty that didn't demand thanks. In their world, justice wasn't shouted in courtrooms. It was the silent rev of an engine arriving uncalled, the shared nod over a flickering neon sign. A knock echoed from the door, sharp, unexpected. Jack rose, his pulse quickening, and peered through the peephole. Voss stood there, coat dusted with snow, his angular face etched with an unease that softened his polished edges. No entourage, no authority, just a man stepping beyond his ledger. Tommy's bike idled closer now, a low, warning hum vibrating through the walls. Jack hesitated, hand on the knob, the moral pull twisting inside him, confront or extend the hand the road had taught him to offer. The air thickened with possibility, the scent of coffee mingling with the crisp bite of winter seeping under the door. Ellie watched from the table, her eyes wide, as if sensing the shift, the small act of opening that door poised to unravel the night's fragile peace. Voss cleared his throat outside, his voice muffled but steady. "Mr. Harlan, I saw you leave the party, and the Santa. I just want to talk." The words carried a tremor, rare for a man who commanded boardrooms, revealing cracks in the armor of judgment. Jack's fingers tightened on the knob, the metal cold against his skin, weighing the choice. Shut out the intruder, or let compassion bridge the divide between worlds. In the silence that followed, Tommy's engine purred supportively, a reminder that no one faced the margins alone. The trailer held its breath, the dawn light lengthening shadows across the floor as the first threads of redemption began to weave through the storm's aftermath. Jack's hand lingered on the doorknob, the brass chilled from the seeping cold, as if the metal itself urged caution. The knock had come like a pebble in a still pond, rippling through the trailer's quiet morning. Ellie's spoon hovered forgotten in her bowl, milk forming a small puddle on the tablecloth, her eyes fixed on him with that unfiltered trust that twisted his gut. Outside, Tommy's bike idled, a low, steady growl, close enough to intervene but restrained, the exhaust's faint tang drifting through the cracks like a whispered vow. Jack drew a breath, the air thick with the percolator's lingering steam and the faint, sweet residue of Ellie's cereal, and turned the knob with a soft click that echoed louder than it should. Voss stood on the stoop, snowflakes melting into dark spots on his wool coat, his breath visible in short, uneven puffs. Up close, without the party's buffer of handshakes and small talk, he looked diminished, shoulders slightly rounded, the lines around his eyes deeper than the ledger-light facade suggested. No tie, just a rumpled shirt collar peeking out, as if the night had unraveled him thread by thread. "Harlan," he said, his voice carrying a gravel edge from disuse, glancing past Jack into the warm glow of the trailer. "I didn't mean to intrude, it's just... last night, the way you left, and that figure following. I followed too. Stupid, maybe, but I couldn't shake it. Jack stepped aside, not inviting but not barring, the door creaking wider on hinges that needed oil. The cold rushed in, carrying the crisp bite of pine and damp earth, brushing against Ellie's bare arms and making her shiver. "Come in," Jack murmured, the words tasting like reluctant gravel. He didn't know why. Perhaps the weariness in Voss's stance, or the echo of his own solitary roads, but shutting him out felt like building another wall in a life already hemmed by them. Ellie slid from her chair, padding closer with wide eyes, clutching the edge of Jack's shirt like a lifeline. Tommy's engine cut off abruptly outside, the sudden silence amplifying the moment. His boots audible now on the gravel as he approached, but held back, a shadow just beyond the threshold. Voss entered hesitantly, wiping his feet on the mat with mechanical precision, his gaze sweeping the cramped space, the mismatched mugs on the counter, the drawings fluttering on the fridge like fragile flags. He removed his coat, folding it over his arm with care, revealing the faint tremor in his hands. "Your daughter," he said, nodding toward Ellie, who peered up at him from behind Jack's leg. She reminds me of my own, Back when? Before the divorce. The admission hung, raw and unpolished, a crack in the CEO's armor that Jack hadn't expected. Voss's eyes, usually sharp with calculation, softened momentarily. Tracing the ribbon still tangled in her hair, Jack guided them to the small living area, the couch sagging under their weight as they sat, the springs protesting with a low sigh. Ellie hovered nearby, her curiosity winning over shyness, offering Voss a tentative smile that he returned with an awkward nod. "Coffee?" Jack asked, more to fill the air than anything, rising to pour from the pot. The liquid steamed into a chipped mug, dark and strong. Handed over without ceremony, Voss accepted it, the warmth seeping through the ceramic to his fingers, and sipped slowly, the steam curling up to veil his face. "I run the mill," he began, his voice steadying. "You know that, but this town, it's bleeding out. Layoffs coming more than I can stop. I saw you there last night, Harlan. A single dad holding it together, and then you left like the whole thing broke you. That Santa, your friend, he followed like some guardian. I thought, I don't know. Trouble." The words landed like snow on embers, stirring the controlled simmer in Jack's chest. Trouble, from the Hawks. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, the leather of his jacket whispering against the fabric. "Trouble's what you make it, Voss. My crew, the Iron Hawks, we fix things, roads, engines, sometimes lives that get stuck." His tone was even, but beneath it the tension coiled, a father's instinct warring with the compassion that had let this man in. Ellie climbed onto the couch beside him, her small hand finding his knee, grounding him as Voss's gaze dropped to the floor, the mug cradled like a confession. "I get it wrong," Voss admitted, his voice dropping to a near whisper, the words pulling from a place long sealed. "The bikers, the folks on the edges, I see threats, liabilities, but last night, watching you with her—" He trailed off, setting the mug down with a soft clink, his fingers lingering on the rim. The room seemed to contract. The heater's hum the only sound, until Tommy stepped inside unannounced, his frame filling the doorway like a quiet sentinel. Snow dusted his shoulders, melting into dark spots on his vest, and he met Jack's eyes with a subtle nod. Permission sought and given. "Morning," Tommy said neutrally, grabbing a chair from the kitchen and straddling it backward, his arms folding over the backrest. No aggression, just presence, the Brotherhood's way of drawing lines without drawing blood. Voss stiffened, but didn't retreat, his jaw working as if chewing on pride. "I followed because my decisions hurt people like you. The mill's closing shifts, and I know it hits hardest here. Your garage, Pete's place, it's next if the contracts dry up." The revelation hit like a slow punch, reframing the night. Voss wasn't just a watcher, he was the architect of their fraying world, the layoffs that shadowed every diner shift and roadside repair. Jack's breath caught, a strained inhale that echoed in the quiet, his hand tightening on Ellie's shoulder. Rage flickered, hot, contained, but compassion tempered it, seeing the man's isolation mirror his own. A CEO adrift in a sea of numbers that couldn't measure loss. Ellie, sensing the shift, slipped from the couch and fetched her stuffed bear, pressing it into Voss's hands with a solemn whisper. "He helps when you're sad." The gesture hung, simple and profound, dissolving the tension like frost under sun. Voss's eyes glistened, his throat working visibly, and he clutched the bear lightly. The fur soft against his calloused palms, from years of desk-bound grip. Tommy leaned in, his voice low. "We don't ride for payback, Voss, but we protect what's ours. If the mill's cutting deep, maybe there's a way to mend it, before the road takes us all." The words wove through the air, heavy with unspoken offers, as the dawn light strengthened, casting long shadows across the floor. Jack watched Voss, the moral suspense thickening. Forgive the hand that could break them, or fight the closing doors. Outside, the snow began to melt, rivulets tracing paths down the window, mirroring the slow thaw in the room. Ellie's hand slipped back into Jack's, warm and steady, a reminder that redemption started small, in the margins where hearts beat loudest against the storm. The light filtering through the trailer's windows had shifted to a pale midday glow, the snow outside melting into muddy rivulets that traced erratic paths down the glass. Jack sat motionless on the couch, his hand still resting on Ellie's shoulder, the warmth of her small frame a fragile counterpoint to the chill seeping back into the room. Voss clutched the stuffed bear, its button eyes staring blankly as if witnessing the unraveling of worlds. Tommy remained straddled on the chair, his posture relaxed but alert, the faint scent of exhaust clinging to his vest like a badge of vigilance. The percolator had gone silent, leaving only the distant drip of melting ice from the awning and the soft rhythm of Ellie's breathing to underscore the weight of Voss's words. "I didn't come here to make excuses," Voss continued, his voice threading through the hush like a frayed wire. He set the bear gently on the coffee table, its plush form slumping against a stack of Ellie's colouring books, pages edged with crayon suns and smiling faces. "The Mills numbers they don't lie, but seeing you last night, leaving with her in your arms, tears you tried to hide, it hit me. I've been cutting costs, shifting contracts to cheaper outfits up north. Your garage, Harlan, it's tied to our maintenance bids. If those go, Pete's place folds, and families like yours." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to his hands, fingers interlaced tightly, knuckles whitening against the strain. Jack's chest tightened, a slow compression, like the vice he used on stubborn bolts at the garage. The revelation landed not as a thunderclap, but a quiet erosion, reframing the night's shadows. Voss wasn't just an observer. He was the force eroding the fragile scaffolding of their lives. The party's forced cheer, the layoffs whispered in diner booths, the endless scramble for parts and paychecks. It all traced back to decisions made in distant offices, far from the desert's unforgiving honesty. Jack's breath came shallow, the air tasting of stale coffee and unspoken accusations. He thought of the mornings he'd left Ellie with Maria before school, riding out to fix engines, while the mill's smokestacks loomed like indifferent sentinels. Loyalty to the Hawks had kept him steady, but this, it threatened the ground beneath their feet. Ellie shifted beside him, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his knee, oblivious to the undercurrents, but sensing the shift in the room's gravity. "Mr. Voss, do you like bears?" she asked, her voice a clear chime, cutting through the tension, tilting her head with innocent curiosity. Voss looked at her, his angular features softening, a faint smile cracking the edges of his reserve. "I do now," he replied, the words carrying a tremor, as if admitting it aloud mended something long fractured. In that pause, the space between them hummed with possibility, the moral pull of forgiveness warring with the instinct to shield what was his. Tommy leaned forward slightly, the chair creaking under his weight, his eyes steady on Voss. "You followed us through the storm, watched from the dark. Why? Not just the mill, is it?" His tone was even, probing without aggression, the Brotherhood's way of drawing truth from silence. Voss exhaled, a long, ragged breath that fogged the air faintly and rubbed his temples, the gesture revealing the exhaustion etched into his skin. "My daughter. She's 8, lives with her mother in the city now. Last Christmas, I missed her recital, stuck in a meeting, closing a deal like this one. She sent a photo, all dressed up, smiling through tears. I saw you with Ellie, Harlan, carrying her out like that weight was yours alone. And the Santa, your friend, trailing like some kind of protector. It stirred something, guilt maybe, or envy. I've built walls around my life, numbers over names, and it's left me watching from the outside." The admission hung heavy, a hidden truth emerging like dawn through fog, reframing Voss not as a villain, but a man adrift in his own margins, isolated by success, haunted by choices that echoed Jack's losses. Jack felt the stirrings of compassion, reluctant but real, blooming amid the controlled rage simmering in his veins. He'd ridden through his own grief after Sarah, the cancer's quiet theft leaving him hollow, piecing together fatherhood on borrowed time and Hawk solidarity. Voss's world was cleaner, sharper, but the loneliness mirrored his own, the unspoken guilt of providing for a child while the heart fractured. "We all watch from shadows sometimes," Jack said finally, his voice low, gravel rough from the night's toll. "But the road, it shows you can't outrun it alone." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trailer's loose siding with a low moan, carrying the faint crunch of gravel under approaching tires. Tommy rose fluidly, crossing to the window in 2 strides, his silhouette blocking the light momentarily. Another vehicle had pulled into the park, a dusty pickup, Pete from the garage, his limp visible as he dismounted, toolbox in hand. He'd come uncalled, likely tipped by a Hawk whisper chain, the Brotherhood's network weaving protection across the miles. Pete nodded toward the trailer, his face weathered like old leather, and began tinkering with the awning's sagging support, a subtle act of mending that spoke louder than words. Voss stood, retrieving his coat with deliberate slowness, the fabric whispering as he shrugged it on. "I can't promise miracles for the mill, but the bids, I'll review them, look for ways to keep local. It's a start." His eyes met Jack's, holding there in a long pause, strained breaths sinking in the quiet. Ellie tugged at Voss's sleeve, offering the bear once more. "Take him, for your daughter." Voss knelt, accepting it with a nod that trembled at the edges, the gesture sealing a fragile bridge between their worlds. As Voss stepped out, the door clicking shut behind him, Jack watched from the window, the CEO's SUV crunching away down the lane, the bear visible on the passenger seat. Tommy clapped Jack's shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. "One choice at a time, brother. That's how we ride." The tension eased, not dissolved but balanced, the revelation's weight lifting just enough to breathe. Ellie hummed a carol softly, her small hand in Jack's, as Pete's hammer echoed outside, a rhythm of quiet justice, loyalty forging paths through the melting snow. The desert stretched beyond, engines waiting in the distance, but in that shared silence, redemption flickered like a spark in the cold. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Jack Harlan reach more people who still believe in humanity. The afternoon sun hung low over the trailer park, its rays slanting through the melting snow like hesitant fingers, turning the muddy paths into glistening veins of silver. Jack stood on the stoop, the wooden step creaking faintly under his weight, as he watched Pete finish with the awning. The older man's hammer strikes measured and sure, each one echoing like a punctuation to the morning's revelations. The air carried the sharp, clean scent of damp earth unearthed from winter's grip, mingling with the faint, oily tang from Pete's toolbox left open on the gravel. Ellie played nearby, her boots squelching in a puddle she pretended was a frozen pond, her laughter light but tentative, as if testing the thawed world around her. Tommy leaned against the trailer's side, arms crossed, his vest catching the light in subtle glints from the silver threads, a quiet sentinel in the shifting light. Inside, the space felt larger now, the tension from Voss's visit dissipating like steam from a cooling engine, leaving behind a hush that invited reflection. Jack stepped back in, the door easing shut with a soft latch, and poured fresh coffee into mugs worn smooth from years of use. The liquid gurgled from the pot, dark and aromatic, filling the room with a warmth that seeped into the cracks of the morning's unease. He handed one to Tommy, who had followed him in, the ceramic passing between calloused palms with a familiarity born of shared roads. "He'll follow through," Tommy said, not quite a question, his voice low as he sipped, the steam curling up to brush his beard. Jack nodded, staring into his own mug, the surface rippling slightly from the trailer's faint vibrations. Perhaps a distant truck rumbling by on the highway, or just the settling of old foundations. The moral weight of the encounter lingered, a quiet suspense resolved not in grand gestures, but in the subtle choice to listen, to extend a hand across the divide. Voss's admission had peeled back layers, revealing a man not unlike Jack himself, haunted by absences, by the slow bleed of decisions that left families frayed at the edges. Jack thought of Sarah's last days, the hospital room's sterile hum, and the way her hand had trembled in his, grasping for one more moment with Ellie. Grief had driven him to the Hawks, to the open road where engines drowned out the silence, but it was their unspoken code that had rebuilt him. Loyalty as a shield, compassion as the fuel that kept the wheels turning. Voss, in his polished isolation, had glimpsed that world last night, trailing through the snow like a shadow seeking light. Ellie wandered in from the yard, her cheeks flushed from the chill, tracking small clumps of mud across the linoleum. She climbed onto a stool at the counter, swinging her legs with a soft patter, and reached for a cookie from the tin. Lopsided stars from the party, salvaged and sweeter now in memory. "Mr. Voss took Mr. Bear," she said, matter-of-factly, crumbling a piece between her fingers, the crumbs scattering like fallen snow. "He'll be okay now, right, Dad?" Her eyes, wide and searching, held no judgment, only the pure faith of a child who believed in small men's. Jack knelt to her level, the floor cool against his knee, and brushed a crumb from her lip, his thumb lingering in that familiar, grounding touch. "Yeah, kiddo, a little kindness goes far." The words carried the weight of his own survival, the nights he'd ridden alone after her mother's passing, the Hawk's engines flanking him like silent guardians, pulling him back from the brink. Outside, Pete called Tommy over with a low whistle, the two men conferring by the toolbox, their voices a murmur lost to the wind. Jack watched through the window, the glass still streaked with meltwater, as they shared a nod, the kind that sealed pacts without paper. The garage would endure, perhaps, Voss's promise a fragile thread in the weave of their lives. But even if it frayed, the brotherhood held, the Iron Hawks scattered along the routes, from dusty diners to empty stretches of asphalt. A network of outcasts who chose protection over isolation. Jack remembered the veteran who'd ridden with them last spring. A quiet man with eyes like faded maps, who'd fixed Ellie's bike after a spill, his hands steady despite the shake from old wounds. No fanfare, just the rev of an engine departing into the dusk, leaving behind a wheel that turned true. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the park, the light fracturing through the cottonwood's bare branches like shards of forgotten glass. Jack gathered Ellie for a walk down the lane, her hand small and warm in his, the gravel crunching under their boots in a rhythm that synced with their steps. Tommy joined them, falling in step without a word, his presence a subtle buffer against the world's indifferent sprawl. They passed the spot where Voss's SUV had idled, now just a patch of churned mud, the tire tracks already softening under the afternoon's thaw. In the distance, the highway hummed, a constant vein pulsing with life, trucks hauling loads, bikes cutting lone paths, lives intersecting in fleeting mercies. As they reached the park's edge, where the desert met the road in a blur of scrub and sky, Ellie pointed to a hawk circling overhead, its wings slicing the air with effortless grace. "Like your patch, Dad," she said, squeezing his hand tighter. Jack looked up, the bird's shadow fleeting across the ground, a reminder of freedoms hard-won and loyalties that soared beyond the margins. The wind carried the faint scent of rain on the horizon, promising renewal amid the survival's grind. Forgiveness wasn't erasure. It was the choice to ride on, lighter for the shared burden. In that moment, with Tommy's steady footfall beside them and Ellie's trust anchoring his steps, Jack felt the quiet justice of it all, the hidden pasts yielding to second chances, compassion threading through the strength that bound them. They turned back toward the trailer as dusk began to settle. The sky bruising into purples and golds, engines cooling in the gathering dark. The road stretched eternal, but in the warmth of their circle, humanity endured, a silent flame against the coming night. The desert wind whispered one last secret, carrying the echo of engines that never truly fell silent, binding outcasts in the glow of unspoken redemption. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching. The case of the single dad left the Christmas party in tears. Santa followed him, and the CEO watched in shock. See you in the next one.